Shattered Silence, A Journey of Survival and Healing, by Nanice Munoz, formerly Nicola Nooks. Chapter 6. Navigating the Complex Ties of Family and Forgiveness. The Challenge of Family Expectations. When my mother asked me to give her my National Housing Trust, NHT points, I felt a deep and familiar conflict rising within me. On the surface, it seemed like a simple request, just one family member helping another. But beneath that request were layers of expectations and assumptions. It also carried an unspoken dismissal of my own needs and aspirations. Those points were more than just numbers. They represented my opportunity to invest in my future, to create a home of my own. Yet here I was, being asked to give them up for her benefit, leaving myself empty-handed and vulnerable. By this time, I had been living on my own, paying rent, and navigating the challenges of adulthood. My mother and sister had already made plans to move into a new house together, plans that did not include me. Yet, despite my exclusion, I was being asked to contribute, though not in a way that acknowledged or supported my own goals. The request wasn't for a joint effort, where pooling our resources would benefit all of us. Instead, she wanted me to W-sign over my points entirely, permanently surrendering a resource I might one day need. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on me. Refusing my mother was not something I took lightly. I had grown up being taught to respect her wishes, often at the expense of my own needs. But this time it felt different. I could feel the tension between honoring her request and prioritizing my own needs. If I gave in, I would be sacrificing the dream I had worked so hard to achieve. It was the dream of purchasing my own home and establishing my independence. When I gently but firmly told her no, her response stung. She asked, "So, you're going to buy a house?" Her tone carried a sharp disbelief, as if the very idea of me owning a home was absurd. In that moment, I realized she didn't see me as someone capable of achieving such a milestone. Her question wasn't just an expression of surprise. It was a reflection of how little she believed in my potential. "Yes," I replied, holding my ground. I knew what I was capable of, even if she couldn't see it. At the time, I hadn't yet obtained a visa or made significant strides toward my dream, but I was working diligently toward a better future. I had faith in my ability to succeed, and I wasn't about to let someone else's doubt dictate my path. Still, her reaction left me questioning my place in her life. It wasn't just about the points, it was about what the request symbolized. To me, it felt like another instance where my contributions and sacrifices were taken for granted. I was being asked to pour out what little I had, without any acknowledgement of my own struggles or aspirations. It wasn't the first time I had felt this way, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. As I reflected on the situation, I couldn't ignore the unequal dynamics that so often defined our family interactions. My sister, who was living with my mother at the time, wasn't asked to make a similar sacrifice. Instead, they moved into the new house together, deepening their bond while I was left on the outskirts. Once again, I was confronted with the disparity I had grown up with, the persistent feeling that my needs and desires were always secondary. This time, however, I chose to prioritize myself. Refusing my mother's request wasn't an act of rebellion or selfishness. It was an act of survival. I realized I couldn't continue to pour from an empty cup. Setting boundaries wasn't about shutting others out. It was about creating space to honor my own goals and dreams. Saying no in that moment was my way of affirming that my life and aspirations held value, even if others failed to acknowledge them. That decision, though empowering, wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt and guilt, but I found solace and clarity through prayer and reflection. I came to understand that my choice wasn't about rejecting my mother's needs. It was about protecting my ability to build a stable foundation for my own life. The Bible reminded me of the importance of stewardship and thoughtful planning for the future. As Proverbs 21 verse 5 teaches, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." That verse became an anchor for me, a reminder that safeguarding my goals was a step toward the abundance God had in store for me. Looking back, I recognize that moment as a turning point in my life. It wasn't just about holding on to my NHT points. It was about something much deeper. It was about learning to advocate for myself and recognizing my worth in a way I hadn't before. Setting boundaries wasn't an act of disrespect. It was an essential declaration of self-respect. The decision to stand firm shaped the course of my life in profound ways. It wasn't easy to assert myself, especially when it came to my mother, who always expected compliance. But prioritizing my future allowed me to take a significant step toward building the life I envisioned for myself. In doing so, I discovered a reservoir of strength within me that I hadn't fully acknowledged. Through this experience, I learned an important truth. Sometimes, the people we love may not understand the vision God has placed in our hearts. But that doesn't mean we should abandon it. Our purpose and potential don't depend on others' approval or understanding. They come from God, who equips us with everything we need to succeed. By trusting in His plan and staying true to myself, I was able to navigate that season of my life with both grace and determination. While it was painful at times, it ultimately brought me closer to the person I was meant to become. The moment of confrontation, seeking answers. After resolving the issue with my National Housing Trust points, I felt a deeper need to confront another chapter of my past, one I had forgiven but never fully understood. While I had made peace in my heart with much of the pain I endured, lingering questions remained. I decided it was time to address them, not out of anger or bitterness, but to seek closure. This time, it was about the man my mother had once claimed was my father, a man who had written me letters filled with unsettling and inappropriate words. These letters weren't just words on paper, they were evidence of manipulation and betrayal. This man had tried to convince me he was my father, when in reality, he was a predator. The content of those letters was a dark reminder of the emotional turmoil I had endured as a child. My decision to confront my mother wasn't driven by anger or resentment. I had long since forgiven her. Instead, I needed to understand why she allowed this falsehood to take root in my life. Why had she let this man's lie define a part of my identity? When I finally decided to bring the letters to her, I approached cautiously but firmly. I handed them over, explaining exactly what they were. The manipulative words of a man who had preyed on my innocence. Then I asked the question that had haunted me for years. Why did you tell me he was my father? I needed to know how she could have allowed such a damaging untruth to shape my life. Her response, while calm, offered no clarity. He asked me to tell you that, she said, as though that explanation could undo the years of confusion and hurt I had carried. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the emotional weight of her decision. I wanted more. I needed more. But her words left me feeling a deep sense of disappointment. This was her opportunity to provide truth, perhaps even to apologize, but instead, I was left with even more questions. I then asked gently, choosing my words carefully to avoid conflict. How could you, as a Christian, allow a man who isn't even a Christian to convince you to tell me something that would affect me so deeply? As my mother, she was supposed to be my protector, the one person I could depend on for truth. Instead, she had allowed someone else's narrative to dictate a significant part of my life. In that same conversation, I found the courage to ask another question I had carried for years. Why did you abuse me? My voice was steady, but beneath it was a quiet, aching hope for honesty. Her response was immediate, a sharp denial. It was brief, cutting, and dismissive, as if the physical and emotional pain I remembered so vividly had never happened. She refused to acknowledge it, as though her denial could erase the scars. Even though I didn't receive the answers I hoped for, the act of confronting her was powerful. This moment wasn't about changing her perspective or forcing her to admit her mistakes. It was about reclaiming my voice and standing in my truth. For years, I had carried those questions in silence. Finally voicing them was an act of liberation, a declaration that my experiences mattered, even if she couldn't validate them. When I walked away from that conversation, my emotions were mixed. Disappointment lingered, along with a sense of incompleteness. I had forgiven her long ago, but I now understood she wouldn't offer the closure I wanted. And yet, there was a quiet strength in knowing I had done what I needed to do for myself. Closure, I realized, doesn't always come from someone else. Sometimes, it is found in the act of confronting the past and choosing to let go of the pain it holds. Denying the truth, a mother's denial. As I walked away from that conversation with my mother, a heavy feeling of incompleteness followed me. I had hoped for closure, but instead, I was left with more questions than answers. The questions I asked about the man who falsely claimed to be my father and the abuse I endured under her roof were met with evasions and denials. I had forgiven her long ago, but part of me still longed for something deeper, an acknowledgement of my pain. It was that universal longing to be seen, to be heard, especially by the one person who was supposed to love and protect me unconditionally. When I confronted her, this time about the emotional and physical abuse I had suffered as a child, I knew my truth. I had lived it. Yet her refusal to acknowledge it cut deeply. In her eyes, I wasn't a victim of neglect or mistreatment. I was simply feisty and stubborn. She dismissed my reality entirely, reducing years of pain, frustration, and sorrow to a matter of attitude. To her, I wasn't a child who had needed care, love, and protection. Instead, I was a problem to be managed, a child who could simply be disciplined into submission. When I tried to make her see my pain, it felt like speaking to a wall. She either couldn't or wouldn't hear me. The years of broken trust, the countless nights I cried myself to sleep, the quiet moments when I sat in silence hoping for a word of comfort, seemed invisible to her. I had hoped for an apology, an acknowledgement that her words, actions, and neglect had hurt me. But instead, I was met with accusations of being difficult, as though my suffering was a product of my own shortcomings and not the result of years of mistreatment. I had forgiven her. I truly had. But forgiveness doesn't erase the yearning for validation. No matter how much I told myself I had moved on, there was still this deep, aching desire for her to finally see me, not as the stubborn or difficult daughter she remembered, but as a person who had been deeply hurt. To her, my pain was an inconvenience. Acknowledging it would mean admitting that she had failed me, that she had hurt me in ways that left lasting scars. Denial was easier for her. Denying my truth was easier than confronting the weight of her choices and their consequences. Despite everything, I couldn't shake the yearning for her validation. I needed to know I wasn't crazy, that the pain I endured wasn't imagined. Every person, regardless of their history, craves that connection with their mother, their acknowledgement, their understanding, their love. Even though I had forgiven her and worked hard to release the hurt, the absence of her recognition still felt like an unfinished chapter in my story. It lingered like a book left open to a page that I could never turn. In the silence that followed our conversation, I came to a difficult realization. I could no longer depend on her to give me the validation I sought. I had to accept that I might never receive it. Her inability to acknowledge her role in my pain wasn't just about me. It reflected her own struggles, her own guilt, and her refusal to confront the truth of her past. While that truth was painful, I also knew I had the power to shape my own healing. I didn't need her acknowledgement to heal. Closure, I realized, would have to come from within me. But that understanding didn't make the process any easier. Her denial became a burden I could no longer carry. Her refusal to confront the truth about the abuse I endured was a reflection of her, not of me. It wasn't just my story. It was hers too, and I couldn't force her to face what she wasn't ready to see. And while forgiveness had freed me from bitterness, I also realized that forgiveness didn't require me to accept her version of events. The truth I carried was mine alone, not as a weight, but as a reflection of my resilience and strength. The gifts that stung, feeling undervalued. During that same period, another moment occurred that deepened my sense of neglect and worthlessness. It came unexpectedly, in the form of a simple gesture, one that carried far more weight than it should have. My mother handed me a pair of shoes. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, a little worn, slightly scuffed, but still serviceable. It wasn't the shoes themselves that struck me. It was the way they were presented, the context in which they were given, and, most importantly, the way they made me feel. "They were your sister's," she said, explaining that my sister was about to throw them away. It was as if the fact that they were salvaged from the garbage should make me grateful to receive them. The implication behind her words hit me harder than the gesture itself. "Here, take this. It's better than nothing." In that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being handed something no one else wanted, that I was somehow less deserving of anything new or untouched. It wasn't about the shoes themselves, it was the underlying message they carried. Once again, I was made to feel like a second thought, expected to accept whatever was left over, as though that's all I was worth. I had worked so hard in my life, fought so fiercely to prove my worth, to create a better future for myself. Yet, in that moment, it felt as though none of it mattered. Instead of being recognized for how far I had come, I was being handed someone else's cast-offs, a clear reminder that my needs and desires were still seen as secondary. The shoes weren't the problem. What hurt was the unspoken message, that I wasn't worthy of anything more than the scraps others didn't want. As I stood there holding the shoes, I couldn't help but reflect on how that moment seemed to encapsulate my relationship with my mother. For years, I had tried to prove that I was capable of more, that I was worthy of more than just the leftovers. Yet here I was, once again being handed something discarded as unimportant. It felt as though she had forgotten everything I had overcome, the sacrifices I had made, and the dreams I had worked so hard to achieve. To her, I was still the child expected to make do with what was left, still the person who should be satisfied with whatever was offered, regardless of how little thought or care went into it. The shoes, I realized, weren't just an object. They were a symbol of how I had been treated for so long, a reminder that I was always an afterthought, always expected to accept what others didn't want. Even now, after all these years, it felt as though my mother still saw me as someone unworthy of effort, someone who didn't deserve to have her needs met in the same way others did. No matter how far I had come, no matter how hard I had worked to create a life of my own, I was still being made to feel as though I didn't deserve the new, the valuable, the things that were given with love and intention. It wasn't the shoes themselves. It was what they represented. They made me feel like I was still that child, overlooked and undervalued, still being asked to take what others had cast aside. That moment forced me to confront an undeniable truth. No matter how much I had forgiven, no matter how much I had worked to let go of the past, these old wounds still had the power to cut deep. It wasn't about the shoes. It was about the implication behind them that I wasn't worth more, that my worth was measured by what others had deemed unworthy. I had spent my life fighting to prove that I was more than what had been handed to me. Yet here I was, once again feeling like I was being judged by the same dismissive standard. It wasn't just the act of receiving something rejected by someone else. It was the lingering feeling that I didn't deserve better, that my dreams, my desires, and my hopes for a better future were somehow irrelevant. The shoes were a tangible reminder of all the times I had been made to feel invisible, all the times my needs had been ignored or dismissed. They weren't just old shoes. They were a symbol of what I had been given, and more painfully, of what I had been denied. And yet, as I held those shoes in my hands, a quiet realization began to take shape. I was worth more than that. I had always been worth more than that. My worth wasn't defined by what others were willing to give me or by how they treated me. It wasn't determined by their ability or inability to see me. I had built something greater for myself, and I would continue to do so. But in that small, painful moment, I was reminded once again of the ways I had been undervalued, unseen, and overlooked. It was as if, no matter how far I had come, I was still haunted by the feeling that I wasn't enough. The shoes were merely a symbol of something deeper, the message they carried, a message I had received countless times throughout my life, a message that told me I was still the child who had to accept whatever others didn't want, the one expected to make do with what was left. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. No matter how much I had grown, no matter how much I had forgiven, those old feelings of inadequacy would linger until I truly claimed the worth I knew I had. My healing wouldn't come from her acknowledgement. It had to come from me. The weight of expectations. Less than and yet more. During one of my rare visits to my mother's home, I learned that my sister was in America. I carried with me a quiet hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, things might begin to improve between us. I yearned for a normal relationship, one where the past didn't hang over us like a shadow. She had never apologized for what she had done, but I had chosen to let it go. I decided to focus on the future, trying to build something meaningful from the little we still shared. I remember one particular moment when she asked me about a personal matter, and I explained everything, though not in full detail, but enough to give her an understanding of what had transpired. I took responsibility, even though I knew that if I had gone into specifics, she would have realized I wasn't entirely at fault. In that moment, I approached the conversation as though we were simply a mother and daughter sharing a meaningful exchange. I allowed myself to be vulnerable, thinking and hoping that my openness might encourage her to see that I was ready for something better between us. Maybe she would meet me halfway. Maybe this was the beginning of the connection I had always wanted. I didn't realize then that this moment of vulnerability would later be shared with my brother to paint me in a negative light. On one of those visits, I found myself sitting in her living room. The air, for once, felt lighter, and my younger brother and sister were there too. We laughed, talked, and even took family pictures together. It felt like a moment of connection, like the gap that had always existed between us was finally beginning to close. For the first time in years, I let myself believe that this could be the start of something different, something better. The warmth I felt was fleeting, but for that brief moment, I held on to it tightly. I wanted to believe that the years of pain and distance were behind us, that we were finally turning a corner. But that fleeting warmth didn't last. Later, when I asked my mother for a simple favor, the fragile hope I had been holding on to began to crack. Her unexpected refusal wasn't just disappointing, it was revealing. I had thought that maybe we were beginning to understand each other, that our bond was growing stronger, but her response brought me back to reality. The warmth I had felt before wasn't grounded in anything real. It was an illusion, a fragile facade that dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. Once again, I was left to confront the depth of our disconnection. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't been ready to see before. Despite the surface-level interactions and occasional moments of apparent closeness, there was no true foundation between us. I had hoped for change, for a shift in our relationship that would allow us to heal, to move forward together. But the truth was that my hope had been built on a fragile assumption that her actions would one day match her words, that the image of a loving mother I carried in my heart could somehow become real. Instead, what I found was the unrelenting weight of expectation. The expectation that I would always be the one to bend, to give, to forgive. As much as I wanted to believe in the moments that felt like steps toward healing, I realized they were just moments, brief flashes that couldn't sustain a deeper connection. Beneath them, nothing had really changed. I was still left navigating our relationship on my own, still carrying the weight of feelings I didn't know how to set down. Inadequacy, frustration, the quiet ache of never quite measuring up to whatever unspoken standard she had for me. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was always being judged, always being measured against a yardstick I could never reach. And as much as I had hoped for things to improve, I realized that I could no longer keep trying to measure my worth by her standards. I had learned to survive without her validation, to find strength within myself. But the weight of those expectations still lingered, like a ghost that refused to let me go. Though I had forgiven her, the pain of feeling undervalued and unseen remained. And with each passing interaction, the hope I once had for a deeper connection with her felt increasingly out of reach. Forgiveness, a choice, not an obligation. Forgiveness was never an easy choice, but it was one I was determined to make. The scripture declares, "If you forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your heavenly Father forgive you." And I knew that unforgiveness could hinder my journey to heaven, a place I deeply longed to be. Yet, forgiveness wasn't something I offered lightly, nor was it something I owed her. I had been hurt in ways far beyond what words could express, but even so, I decided that forgiveness was possible. I chose to forgive her not because she deserved it, but because I needed it. Resentment and bitterness were poisons I refused to entertain. I came to understand that those feelings would have bound me to the past, weighing me down and keeping me from living fully. Despite the pain she caused, the neglect, the emotional and physical abuse, I realized forgiveness wasn't about her. It was about me. It was a choice I had to make for my own peace, my own healing, and my own future. Healing and moving forward required me to release every weight of unforgiveness. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about excusing her actions or erasing the past, but it was about finding freedom. It was about choosing peace over pain and reclaiming my life from the grip of the past. It took time to come to that conclusion. There were moments when it felt easier to hold on to my anger, to stay bitter because it felt justified. My mother had let me down in so many ways, and she hadn't apologized for it. She hadn't even acknowledged the depth of the pain she caused. But forgiveness was never about waiting for an apology that might never come, nor was it about her changing. Forgiveness was about me finding the strength to let go of the power her actions had over me. The emotional weight of forgiveness was heavy, but with every decision to forgive, my heart grew lighter. It wasn't a one-time choice, but an ongoing process. Each time the past resurfaced, I had to decide again to forgive. Some days I felt like I had made progress. Other days it felt like I was back at square one, dragged into the pain all over again. Forgiveness wasn't linear, It ebbed and flowed. But through the setbacks, I kept choosing to forgive. I kept choosing to release the hold anger had on me. In forgiving her, I wasn't saying that what happened was okay. It wasn't okay. It wasn't okay that I was mistreated, neglected, or that I suffered emotionally and physically in a place that should have been safe and loving. Forgiveness didn't excuse or justify her actions. It was about acknowledging that I could no longer let her actions define my life. I couldn't control her behavior, but I could control how I responded to it. I had the power to release the bitterness and hurt, and I chose to use that power for my healing. Forgiveness didn't change the past. It didn't erase the years of pain or make everything right. It didn't mean I forgot what had happened or that I was willing to expose myself to further harm. But forgiveness freed me from the chains of resentment. I didn't have to carry the weight of the past with me anymore. I could move forward not with a heart full of bitterness, but with a heart full of peace. I came to understand that forgiveness wasn't a single decision. It was a lifelong process. There would always be moments when the past tried to creep back in, when memories of what I endured threatened to overwhelm me. But each time, I could choose to forgive again. Each time, I had the opportunity to choose freedom over bondage and peace over pain. Forgiving my mother didn't mean that what happened was acceptable, nor did it mean our relationship was suddenly healed. It didn't mean forgetting or pretending that nothing had ever happened. What it did mean was that I was no longer allowing her actions to control my future. I refused to let the past define me anymore. Instead, I chose to move forward, to heal, and to live a life that was no longer held captive by anger and resentment. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a gift I was giving her. It was a gift I was giving myself. It was the key that unlocked the door to my healing and the path to a future where I could live with peace, even if that peace didn't come from reconciliation. I wasn't waiting for her to change or apologize. I had already made the choice to let go of the past and create a life free from the chains of resentment, moving toward closure. When I confronted my mother with the truth of my past, I was met with a painful realization. Closure might never come from her. Despite all my efforts, all the years I spent hoping for acknowledgement, I finally understood that she wasn't ready to face the reality of what had happened. She wasn't prepared to admit the pain she caused, and that was something I had to accept. This moment was pivotal. It marked a turning point in my emotional journey, where I realized that closure wasn't something she could give me. It had to come from within myself. For years, I had longed for her acknowledgement, for an apology that never came. I thought that if I could make her see the truth, if I could just get her to understand the depth of the hurt, then maybe things would be different. I believed that her understanding would somehow allow us to heal together, but I had to let go of that dream. The more I held on to the hope that she would provide me with the closure I so desperately craved, the more it kept me tied to the pain of the past. I realized that the closure I sought wasn't hers to give. It was mine to claim. Letting go of my need for closure from her was one of the hardest, yet most liberating steps in my healing journey. For years, I had tried to repair a relationship that was fractured beyond repair. I had waited for her to acknowledge the things I had endured, for her to offer some form of apology or recognition that might validate my experiences. But each attempt was met with resistance and denial. The weight of those unmet expectations grew heavier and heavier until I finally understood that the only way forward was to release my attachment to her approval, her understanding, and her validation. It wasn't an easy process. Letting go felt like losing a part of myself that I had carried for so long. The need for validation, the desire to hear the words I had always longed for, was a deep ache that had shaped much of my emotional life. But over time, I began to see that I didn't need her acknowledgement to be worthy of love, healing, or peace. My worth wasn't tied to her recognition or apology. I was worthy simply because I was, regardless of whether she ever understood my pain or took responsibility for what had happened. Releasing my need for closure was a profound act of freedom. No longer did I have to hold my breath, hoping she would change or suddenly see the truth. I let go of the emotional weight tied to the hope of reconciliation, and in doing so, I found the freedom I had been searching for. I stopped looking for her to fix me or to make it right. I finally understood that healing had to come from within, not from her, but from me. This wasn't just about forgiving her. It was also about forgiving myself. I had to forgive myself for holding on to expectations that were never going to be met. I had to release the emotional burden I had carried for years, the burden of hoping for a version of our relationship that was never going to exist. I realized I had spent so much time yearning for something that wasn't real, and I had to make the conscious choice to stop. I forgave myself for hoping, for waiting, and for believing that my healing was tied to her actions. It wasn't. Letting go of my need for closure allowed me to finally find peace within myself. My healing no longer depended on whether or not she came to terms with the past. I began to see that I had been healing all along, even without her acknowledgement. My journey wasn't hers to control, but it was my own. And once I truly understood that, everything changed. I discovered that I could move forward without the weight of the past holding me back. I didn't need her to understand in order to heal. I could love myself in spite of her inability to acknowledge the hurt. I could live with joy and peace, knowing I had reclaimed my own power and taken control of my healing. Letting go of my need for closure didn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending the past didn't matter. It meant choosing not to let the past define me. I refused to let it control my emotions, my thoughts, or my future. I also understood that healing would never be a straight line. There would still be moments when the past resurfaced, when the pain felt fresh again. But I had made the decision to release the emotional grip the past had on me. And each time those memories crept back in, I chose to forgive again. I chose to move forward. The closure I had once longed for wasn't going to come from her. It had to come from me. And once I realized that, I embraced a renewed sense of freedom. In the end, closure wasn't something I could wait for someone else to give me. It was something I had to give myself. It was about accepting that some things would never be resolved and finding peace in the fact that I could heal without answers. I didn't need her acknowledgement to move on. I was free to write my own story, to define my healing, and to live a life no longer constrained by the past. The road to self-worth, reclaiming my value. Reclaiming my sense of self-worth was a journey, a slow, deliberate process filled with effort, pain, and setbacks. It didn't happen overnight. It required learning to see myself for who I truly was, beyond the scars and the voices that once tried to define me. For so long, I had looked at myself through the lens of my past wounds. My mother's harshness, the mistreatment I endured, and the shame that had taken root in my heart. But as I began to step more deeply into my faith, I discovered a life-changing truth. I was not what I had suffered, nor was I defined by what others had said about me. I was far more than the sum of my past experiences. I was a child of God, made in His image, worthy of love, respect, and peace. The first steps in reclaiming my worth were rooted in my faith. While I had always known that God was with me, even during my darkest moments, it wasn't until I leaned fully into that faith that I began to see myself differently. I stopped seeing myself as a victim of circumstances. My identity wasn't shaped by the mistakes of others or by the unhealed wounds they had left behind. Instead, I began to draw strength from the truth of God's unwavering love for me. The Bible reminds us, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made," Psalm 139 verse 14. I began to claim this truth for myself, letting it take root in my soul and shift how I saw my reflection. The pull of the past was strong, and there were moments when I questioned my worth. Transitioning out of the pain wasn't easy, but through prayer, reflection, and reading the Word, I began to uncover a new version of myself. I saw someone who was strong, capable, and filled with potential. God's love, unconditional and steady, became the foundation upon which I rebuilt my life. Each time I affirmed my worth, I let go of the lies that had weighed me down for so long. I released the shame, guilt, and resentment that had clung to me, replacing them with the truth that I was loved by a higher power, with a purpose uniquely designed for me. Part of reclaiming my worth was learning to build boundaries, a critical step in my healing. For years, I allowed others, particularly my mother, to define my value. Her words and actions shaped how I saw myself, leaving me feeling unworthy of love, respect, or kindness. But as I grew in faith and began to understand my inherent value, I realized that I needed to protect myself from further harm. Building boundaries wasn't about shutting people out. It was about honoring my needs, my emotional well-being, and my sense of self. I learned that it was okay to say no, to step back, and to distance myself from relationships that no longer served me or respected my worth. Creating boundaries didn't mean I stopped loving others. It meant I started loving myself enough to stop tolerating toxicity. Another key realization was that I had to stop seeking validation from others. For years, I longed for acknowledgement, for my mother's love and approval, and for some external recognition of my pain. But I came to see that validation from others was fleeting. True worth came from within. Once I began to affirm my value through my relationship with God, I no longer needed external approval to feel whole. I discovered peace in knowing that I was enough just as I was, and I no longer sought to mold myself to fit anyone else's expectations. There were moments when memories of the past would resurface, moments that threatened to pull me back into the feelings of smallness and inadequacy. But I reminded myself that those memories no longer defined me. I wasn't the girl who had been abandoned, neglected, or mistreated. I was a woman with purpose, dreams, and a future. I had faced my pain, confronted my past, and made the choice to live the life that God had prepared for me. One of the most liberating parts of this journey was letting go of the need for others, especially my mother, to understand or acknowledge my pain. I didn't need her validation, apology, or acknowledgement to heal. Forgiveness became an act of self-liberation. I forgave her, not for her sake, but for mine. I chose to release the emotional weight that had tethered me to the past, understanding that my healing didn't depend on her actions. It depended on my decision to let go. By giving up the need for external closure, I found freedom. I no longer waited for her acknowledgement or her apology. I didn't need her permission to move forward. My healing wasn't tied to her. It was mine to own, embracing my worth and moving forward. Standing in the freedom of this reclaimed self-worth, I saw myself clearly for the first time. I wasn't the broken girl who had been discarded or forgotten. I wasn't defined by the neglect or mistreatment of my past. I was a woman of strength, faith, and purpose. I was deserving of love, respect, and all the good things life had to offer. My past no longer held power over me. Instead, my faith, my choices, and my self-love became the foundation for the life I was building. Reclaiming my worth gave me the confidence to step boldly into the future. I was no longer afraid to create new relationships, pursue my dreams, or believe in my right to happiness and success. My life was no longer shadowed by the pain of my past, but illuminated by the hope, strength, and love I had cultivated within myself. I realized that my worth wasn't just about who I had been, it was about who I was becoming. And as I moved forward, I carried with me the understanding that I was enough, not because of what anyone said or did, but because I had chosen to believe it for myself. That concludes Chapter 6. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for Chapter 7 in the next video.